The sky above Normandy was a furnace that afternoon. Smoke trailed across the clouds like torn ribbons, and somewhere in the chaos, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 spun out of control. The German pilot, Kurt Meissner, fought the stick until the last second. His gauges failed, his engine sputtered, and flames wrapped around the cockpit glass. With no choice left, he pulled the lever and was thrown into the air, a black speck against the sky on fire. The parachute opened late, half-burned, whipping him sideways through the wind. He hit the ground hard in a wheat field, the world exploding in silence around him. His right leg twisted unnaturally. Pain clawed up his body. He tore off his gloves and stared at his trembling hands, once trained to fly with precision, now shaking like a child's. All around, the thunder of artillery echoed from distant hills. The front was moving fast, and he knew what that meant. He had landed behind enemy lines. The American patrols were closing in. He had seen what they did to downed pilots, or so he had been told. Kurt crawled, dragging his injured leg through tall grass until he reached a farm on the edge of a dirt road. The barn door stood open, its hinges squealing in the wind. He pulled himself inside, collapsing beside a stack of hay bales. The air smelled of dust, iron, and old cattle. He pressed his hand to his thigh, warm blood soaked through his uniform. He whispered in German, "Mother, forgive me," as he tied a belt around his leg to slow the bleeding. The pain came in waves. Outside, he could hear the faint growl of an approaching jeep. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath. "This is it," he thought. "They'll find me. It's over." The sound of footsteps crunched on gravel. Voices followed. American, young, relaxed but alert. One of them laughed faintly. Then silence. The barn door creaked. A shaft of daylight fell across the hay. Boots appeared first, then a rifle barrel. "Got something here?" one soldier called. Kurt's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. He raised his hands slowly, his helmet rolling away. "Nichts Skiasen. I surrender," he muttered. 3 soldiers entered. Their uniforms bore dust, sweat, and the star-spangled patch of the U.S. Army. The oldest, Sergeant Miller, kept his rifle steady but didn't fire. A second, Corporal Reed, crouched down, noticing the dark stain spreading through Kurt's flight suit. "He's hit bad, Sarge," Reed said. "Looks like he's been here a while." Miller hesitated. "Orders say we move on. Leave prisoners for the MPs." Reed frowned. "He won't make it another hour." The third soldier, Private Daniels, just stared. This was the first German pilot he had ever seen up close. Young, pale, terrified. Not a monster, not a uniform, just another man trying to breathe. Finally, Miller exhaled and lowered his weapon. "Get the kit," he said. Reed pulled a bandage from his pack. Kurt flinched when the cloth touched his skin. Why are you helping me?" he asked in broken English. Reed didn't answer right away. He just tightened the bandage and said, "Because we can." For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind moving through the cracks in the barn wall. Miller looked down at the German's trembling hands. "You got a name, pilot?" "Kurt," he whispered. "Kurt Meissner." "Well, Kurt," Miller said, "you're lucky. War's got enough dead men. We don't need one more." Kurt tried to respond, but his voice broke. The tears came quietly at first, then without restraint. He wasn't crying from pain. It was confusion, disbelief, the shattering of everything he had been told about Americans. He had been taught they were savages, destroyers, men without mercy. Yet here they were, cleaning his wound, giving him water, treating him like a brother. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the faint echo of artillery from miles away. The war continued without them. But inside that wooden barn, for a fleeting hour, 3 American soldiers and 1 wounded German found something the battlefield had forgotten: humanity. When the morphine dulled the pain, Kurt whispered, "If I ever live, I will remember this." Miller stood, brushing straw from his jacket. "Good. Remember that not every man who carries a gun has forgotten his soul." The door creaked again as they prepared to move. Kurt lay back, staring at the beams above him, the light filtering through cracks like thin rays of grace. For the first time in years he felt safe. He thought he had fallen into enemy hands. Instead he had fallen into mercy. This story, told and retold among veterans, may have changed in the years that followed. But behind every retelling lies a truth, that even in the darkest war, decency had its own quiet victories. Before we continue deeper into this story of compassion and courage, Make sure to subscribe to channel, where real history meets the human heart. By August of 1944, Europe had become a single battlefield. The invasion of Normandy, D-Day, had already rewritten history just 2 months earlier. What had begun as a desperate gamble on June 6 had turned into a relentless push inland. The beaches that once bled red were now supply roads. Tanks rolled through hedgerows and American soldiers pushed deeper into the French countryside, one farmhouse at a time. The world was watching the slow collapse of Nazi Germany, but no one on the ground felt like a victor. Every mile gained came at a cost. France was scarred, its towns crushed beneath bomb craters and artillery fire. The air smelled of smoke and diesel. Allied bombers filled the skies by day, while searchlights and flak tore the darkness by night. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was now on its knees. Years of non-stop combat had gutted its ranks. Pilots were younger, barely trained, their machines patched together from whatever parts were left. Gasoline was scarce, morale even scarcer. Yet Hitler's command demanded that they keep flying, that every pilot fight to the last breath. The Americans, by contrast, were fresh and organized. They brought with them an energy, a confidence that no empire could manufacture. The P-51 Mustang, sleek, fast, silver like a blade, dominated the air. It was more than an airplane, it was a statement of freedom, built in Detroit and flown by farm boys who'd never seen Europe before. The men who flew them believed in something simple, that tyranny should not own the sky. Above the patchwork fields of Normandy, these two worlds collided every day. The German fighters still came, diving through flak and tracer fire, desperate to stop the Allied advance. Sometimes they succeeded. Most times they didn't. It was in this collapsing air war that Kurt Meissner's story began. He was one of the few German pilots still flying defensive patrols along the Seine Valley. The orders were clear: intercept Allied bombers heading east no matter the odds. But his unit was fractured. Radar coverage was broken. Fuel lines were sabotaged by the French resistance. Every mission felt like walking into a storm. On the morning of his final flight, Kurt's Messerschmitt was already limping before it left the airfield. The mechanics had worked overnight, welding a cracked coolant line with field tools. They told him it would hold for one more sortie. It didn't. When his engine failed over enemy territory, he wasn't surprised. He was just tired. The German high command called it duty. The pilots called it suicide. Beneath those skies, the land told its own story. Normandy was no longer the peaceful patchwork of orchards and stone cottages it had once been. Villages stood half empty, windows shattered, the distant sound of artillery humming like thunder. Farmers worked their fields under the shadow of wrecked tanks. Children played beside shell holes. To the Americans advancing through that landscape, it looked like the cost of liberation. To the Germans retreating, it looked like the death of everything they knew. The U.S. soldiers carried photographs in their breast pockets. Wives, sweethearts, kids. They wrote letters home from the back of ration boxes, promising they'd return soon. Most didn't understand French, but they shared cigarettes with villagers, fixed broken wells, and gave out chocolate. Wherever they went, they carried a sense of who they were, not conquerors but men on borrowed time. That same humanity began to vanish from the German side. Propaganda filled their heads with fear. They were told that capture meant torture, that Americans showed no mercy. For years, those lies kept men like Kurt fighting when they should have surrendered. But now, as 1944 turned toward its bloody autumn, the truth was starting to show. Prisoners of war were being treated well. Many German soldiers surrendered voluntarily, trading their rifles for a chance at survival. The myth of the merciless American was crumbling, replaced by quiet stories of compassion that spread from camp to camp. Still, fear lingered. For a pilot shot down behind enemy lines, there was no guarantee of mercy. A crash landing could mean execution by angry civilians or being mistaken for a spy. The only safety lay in staying hidden until capture, or until death found you first. And so, on that summer day when Kurt Meissner fell from the clouds and crashed into the golden fields of Normandy, he carried with him every terror a German soldier could know. He had fought for years believing that honor meant obedience. But now, lying broken in a barn surrounded by foreign soil, he began to question whether obedience had any honor left in it. The war around him was changing. The old lines between good and evil, between duty and decency, were blurring. The men in olive drab who hunted him were not monsters. They were kids from Iowa, Chicago, and Pennsylvania, men who'd grown up on stories of the Great Depression and baseball, not conquest. And yet, somewhere above them all, the ideals that separated these two sides still burned. One fought to dominate. The other fought to liberate. In that contrast, the essence of the American spirit emerged, not in speeches, not in victories, but in how they treated their enemy when the guns went silent. By late summer, the Allied front was surging eastward. Paris would soon be liberated. The Germans were in retreat, leaving behind wrecked vehicles, scattered equipment, and wounded men too weak to follow. Among those left behind was a single pilot lying in a quiet barn, surrounded by the rumble of tanks in the distance. Somewhere beyond those fields, history was being written in headlines and telegrams. But in that small corner of France, another story, smaller, quieter, more human, was about to unfold. A story that would never make it into official reports, yet would outlive them all. Because long after the smoke cleared, what people remembered wasn't just how wars were fought, but how men behaved when victory was already theirs. And that is where the story of Sergeant Miller and Kurt Meissner truly begins, not in hatred but in the fragile miracle of mercy that can still survive when Europe is in flames. Kurt Meissner was born in Munich in 1922, the only child of Wilhelm and Greta Meissner. His father worked long shifts at an Opel factory fixing engines and welding steel frames. His mother was a piano teacher who believed music could survive even in the darkest times. Their apartment sat above a bakery, and on winter mornings, the smell of fresh bread mixed with the sound of her playing Chopin. In those early years, Germany was still bleeding from its past. The adults whispered about the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, about food shortages, about men who never returned from the Great War. To a child like Kurt, the world was confusing but simple. His family was proud, hardworking, and poor. When he turned 10, members of the Hitler Youth came to his school. They spoke with booming voices about loyalty, discipline, and the rebirth of the nation. They promised every boy a uniform, adventure, and purpose. His father stayed silent, but his mother frowned as she signed the paper. She didn't like politics. "Remember, Kurt," she said that night, "obedience is not the same as honor." He didn't understand then, but he would. At first he loved it, the marching, the songs, the feeling of belonging. The world suddenly seemed clear. Germany was rising again and he was part of something greater than himself. But as the years passed, training turned from games into drills, from camaraderie into competition. Teachers disappeared. Neighbors vanished. Questions became dangerous. By the time he turned 19, he was drafted into the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. His mechanical skills and sharp reflexes made him a natural pilot. He trained on the Messerschmitt Bf 109, a sleek, fast machine that seemed almost alive beneath his hands. The first time he took off alone, the earth dropped away and he felt both terrified and invincible. The sky became his refuge, the only place untouched by propaganda or fear. But even there the illusion cracked. The war was changing. What had started as a mission of pride had become a desperate fight for survival. Fuel was scarce, spare parts rarer still. Commanders spoke of sacrifice rather than victory. Pilots vanished without ceremony, their names never mentioned again. Kurt's squadron had once been 30 men. By the summer of 1944, only 6 remained. They were all under 25. Their faces looked older than their years, their eyes hollow from exhaustion. On the morning of August 8, 1944, Kurt's orders were simple: intercept an Allied bomber formation heading toward Paris. But simplicity had long since died in the war. The American planes, B-17 Flying Fortresses, escorted by P-51 Mustangs, filled the sky like a metal storm. The Luftwaffe's dwindling fighters were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of luck. Kurt never saw the shot that hit him. One second he was climbing into the sun, the next his cockpit filled with smoke. The engine sputtered, caught fire, and the propeller stopped cold. His oxygen mask melted against his cheek. For a moment he thought about riding the plane down, ending it quickly like some of his comrades had done. But instinct overruled pride. He pulled the canopy release, yanked the parachute handle, and was ripped into the freezing air. The fall was violent, chaotic. The wind tore at his face, his vision blurred. Below him stretched a sea of wheat fields, speckled with ruins and smoke columns. He hit the ground hard, rolling until the pain in his ribs made him gasp. When he opened his eyes, the sky was blue again, quiet, almost peaceful. No engines, no shouting, no orders. Just birds and the distant echo of artillery. He lay there for a while, feeling the earth under his hands, the strange weight of being alive. He gathered what little he had left: a pistol with one clip, a torn flight map, and a small silver locket. Inside was a photo of his parents taken before the war. His mother's handwriting was on the back: "Come home safe." He limped toward the nearest cover, an old barn half hidden by a line of trees. Inside, the air smelled of hay, manure, and rust. Sunlight cut through the cracks in the wood like thin blades. He sank into a pile of straw, his whole body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. Hours passed. He heard engines, distant shouting, the grinding of tank treads. Allied troops were moving through the region fast. Every day the German line shrank further east. He was behind enemy lines, alone, with no radio and no hope of rescue. He thought about his friends: Hans, who'd been shot down over Normandy; Dieter, who'd crashed in the North Sea; Erich, who'd promised they'd all drink beer in Munich after the war. None of them had made it. Kurt pressed his hand to his face and whispered a prayer, not for victory but for forgiveness. He wasn't even sure who he was praying to anymore. Then came the memory that had haunted him for months: a bombing run over Warsaw in 1943. He'd been ordered to strafe a railway yard. He obeyed because orders were absolute. But afterward, when the smoke cleared, he saw the bodies: civilians, not soldiers. Women, children, the old. The image had never left him. That was the day he stopped believing in the Reich. Now, crouched in that barn, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: shame. He whispered to himself, "What have we done?" Night fell. The barn grew cold. He wrapped himself in his flight jacket, listening to the distant rumble of artillery moving further east. The war was leaving him behind, and for the first time he didn't mind. When dawn came, he heard voices, American accents. They were close. Boots crunched on gravel. Kurt's pulse quickened. He thought about running, but there was nowhere to go. His pistol suddenly felt heavy and useless in his hand. He tossed it aside. The door creaked open. A silhouette filled the frame, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the unmistakable helmet of an American soldier. "Hands where I can see him," the voice barked. Kurt raised his trembling hand slowly. His throat was dry. The soldier stepped closer, weapon steady. Another man appeared behind him, younger, with curious eyes. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air between them was thick with silence and dust. Kurt finally said in broken English, "I am not enemy. I am just finished." The older soldier's expression shifted, not soft but less hard. He motioned for Kurt to stand. The young German obeyed, unsteady on his feet. As they led him out of the barn, sunlight washed over the field. The wheat swayed gently in the wind, indifferent to who owned it. And in that strange, quiet moment, Kurt Meissner, once a proud pilot of the Reich, realized something profound: the war might end, but its ghosts would not. He looked at the American soldiers walking beside him. They weren't demons as he'd been told. They were just men, tired and dirty, wanting the same thing he did: a way home. And somewhere inside him, the words of his mother returned: "Kindness is not weakness." The first thing Kurt Meissner saw when the barn door opened was sunlight glinting off the muzzle of an American M1 rifle. The second thing he saw were the eyes behind it, calm, hard, and ready. "Hands up. Don't move." Kurt froze, both hands trembling in the air. His ribs ached from the crash, his head still ringing from the impact. Standing before him were 3 American soldiers, mud-streaked, tired, and carrying the weight of 100 miles of combat. Their uniforms were faded, their boots caked with the same dirt that had once been battlefield dust. The man holding the rifle was Sergeant John Miller, mid-40s, the kind of soldier who had seen too much to flinch anymore. His jaw was clenched, his expression carved from exhaustion and suspicion. Behind him stood Private Daniels, barely 20, his helmet slightly too big, his face too young for war. He kept shifting his weight nervously, gripping his weapon tighter than he should. The third man, Corporal Reed, knelt beside a field medic bag. His hands were already dirty from dressing wounds that weren't his own. They stared at the German pilot in silence. The smell of hay and blood filled the air. Somewhere outside, a cow lowed softly, unaware that history was unfolding in its stall. Miller broke the silence first. "Your Luftwaffe, huh?" Kurt hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." His voice was hoarse. "Pilot." Daniels muttered, "Could be a spy. Could be armed." Reed stepped forward, cautious but unafraid. If he was armed, we'd already know. Look at him, he's half dead. Kurt tried to speak again, but his words came out like sand. Water. Miller didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the prisoner. You speak English? Enough, Kurt said. Please. Daniels looked to his sergeant. Orders say we don't help enemy wounded unless cleared by command. He's Luftwaffe, Sarge. These guys shot at our boys over Normandy. Maybe at us. Miller said nothing. His finger hovered near the trigger, but something in his face shifted. Not compassion, not yet, but recognition. The war had taken too much from both sides, and killing one more half-conscious man wasn't going to change anything. Reed knelt beside Kurt and examined the gash across his leg. The blood had dried in a dark crust. He's got shrapnel. Infection'll kill him before we do. Miller exhaled slowly. Fine. Patch him up, but keep your weapon close. Daniels frowned. You're serious? Do it, Private. Reed pulled a morphine syringe from his pack. Hold still, he said almost gently. Kurt flinched at the sight of the needle but didn't resist. The warmth spread through his veins, dulling the pain, replacing it with something stranger, relief. Daniels watched, still unconvinced. You really think he'd do the same for us? Reed didn't look up. Doesn't matter what he'd do. Matters what we do. Miller glanced out through a crack in the barn wall, scanning the horizon. We're behind schedule already. Command's pushing north to Paris. We can't haul prisoners. We'll hand him over to the MPs when they sweep this area. Kurt, barely conscious, whispered, Why, help me? I am your enemy. Miller turned back to him. His voice was rough but steady. Not today. The words hung in the air. Daniels shifted uncomfortably. Reed met the pilot's eyes, and for a brief second both men, enemies on paper, looked at each other as human beings. Reed offered him a canteen. Drink. Slowly. Kurt took a cautious sip. The water was warm, metallic, but to him it tasted like mercy. Outside, artillery thundered in the distance, a low rumble rolling across the fields like a reminder that peace was still far away. Daniels sat down on a bale of hay, shaking his head. You know, back home they make posters saying these guys are monsters. Animals. My brother was killed by one of their bombers last year. And now we're saving one. Reed answered without looking up. Your brother didn't die so we could become monsters too. Miller's tone cut through the quiet. Enough talk. We'll move at dusk. Keep your eyes open. The day dragged on. Dust motes floated in the sunlight. Reed changed Kurt's bandage twice, checking his pulse, wiping the sweat from his forehead. Daniels kept guard near the doorway, rifle never lowered. Miller sat against the wall, smoking a cigarette down to its filter. At one point, Kurt stirred. You have family? He asked weakly. Reed nodded. Wife in Kansas City. 2 kids. Kurt smiled faintly. You are lucky. Reed hesitated. Luck's a strange word out here. Kurt closed his eyes again. He could hear the Americans whispering in low voices, sometimes arguing, sometimes laughing. It was the first human warmth he'd felt since leaving home. By evening, the barn was bathed in orange light. The sound of distant aircraft echoed faintly overhead. Daniels checked his rifle again. Sarge, you sure we shouldn't turn him in now? We could radio command. Miller shook his head. No signal this far out. We're lucky we haven't run into a patrol yet. We stay put until dark. He looked at Kurt again. You from Berlin? Kurt shook his head. Munich. My mother plays piano. Or played. Mine taught Sunday school, Miller said after a pause. Guess mothers are the same everywhere. Kurt gave a tired smile. She told me, kindness is not weakness. Miller crushed the cigarette under his boot. She was right. There was a long silence, not awkward, just heavy. Each man seemed to be fighting his own private war inside that barn. Daniels muttered, if command finds out we gave him morphine, they'll court-martial us. Reed said quietly, then I'll take the blame. Miller looked at him. You sure about that, Corporal? Yes, sir. The sergeant studied him for a moment, then gave a short nod. All right. Then it stays between us. Hours passed. The sun disappeared behind the trees. Reed dozed for a few minutes, Daniels kept watch, and Miller cleaned his rifle in silence. Then from outside came the distant hum of approaching vehicles. Jeeps, maybe tanks. Headlights flashed briefly through the cracks in the wood. Enemy patrol? Daniels whispered. Miller listened carefully. No. That's ours. Time to move. Reed looked down at Kurt. He can't walk on that leg. Then we carry him, Miller said flatly. Daniels blinked. You're kidding. I said we carry him. They tore off part of a wooden gate, fashioned it into a makeshift stretcher and lifted Kurt onto it. He groaned, half-conscious. As they stepped into the cool night, the sky was filled with the glow of distant fires. The war was still raging all around them, but for the four men in that moment, it felt like something else entirely, a fragile truce born out of exhaustion and decency. Halfway down the dirt road, Kurt spoke again, voice barely audible. Sergeant Miller? Yeah. You didn't have to do this. Miller looked straight ahead, jaw tight. Maybe not. But I got tired of watching people die for flags. Kurt's eyes fluttered shut, his breathing slow and steady. Reed adjusted the stretcher and muttered, He'll live. Miller nodded. Good. Maybe that's enough for one day. The three Americans walked on through the fields, the sound of their boots lost beneath the hum of distant warplanes. Behind them, the barn stood empty, its door swinging gently in the wind, a silent witness to the moment when enemies remembered what it meant to be human. And though none of them would say it out loud, each man felt the same quiet truth settle in his chest. Mercy had a cost, but it was worth paying. Night had fallen across the French countryside. The fields were silent except for the faint rumble of distant artillery. Inside an abandoned farmhouse, the Americans had taken shelter. The wind slipped through the cracks in the wooden boards, carrying with it the smell of gunpowder and wheat. Sergeant John Miller sat near a flickering lantern, rubbing dirt from his hands. Corporal Reed unpacked his field kit on the table. Rolls of bandage, morphine vials, a Red Cross armband worn thin from use. Private Daniels kept watch near the window, his rifle resting across his lap. Kurt Meissner lay on a cot they had built from planks and rope. His leg was tightly wrapped, the bleeding slowed but not stopped. He was pale, exhausted and silent. Miller broke the quiet. You said your father fought in the last war, didn't you, Reed? Reed nodded slowly. Yeah. World War I, France too. 1918. What did he tell you about it? Miller asked. Reed hesitated, then answered. He said he once found a German boy in a crater. Barely 19. Both legs gone. The kid kept asking for water in broken English. Dad gave him his own canteen. Said he didn't know why. Just did. Daniel snorted. Different times. These krauts now? They'd cut our throats soon as look at us. Reed's eyes narrowed. Maybe. But that's the thing, Private. My old man said mercy doesn't need timing. You either have it or you don't. Miller leaned back, staring at the lantern flame. Your father had the right idea. We didn't come here to become what we're fighting. Daniels frowned. Then what are we fighting for, Sarge? Feels like we're just trading bullets in someone else's backyard. Miller looked at him steadily. We're fighting for something the Nazis forgot existed, decency. You don't have to like the enemy to remember you're still human. Reed tied off the last bandage around Kurt's leg, then marked it with a small red cross in chalk. Red means treated, he said quietly. If they find him, they'll know he's under medical care. Geneva rules. Daniels gave a dry laugh. You think Hitler cares about the Geneva Convention? Reed shook his head. Doesn't matter if he does. We do. Miller's tone was calm but firm. That's the American way, son. We fight hard, but we fight fair. We leave no man behind, not ours, not theirs, if we can help it. Daniels stared into the dark outside. Feels like we're the only ones playing by the rules. Then let that be our strength, Miller said. Rules are what keep us from becoming animals. Kurt stirred on the cot, his voice weak but clear. Why? Why help me? Miller turned. Because war ends someday. And when it does, I'd rather look at my hands and not see blood I didn't have to spill. Kurt swallowed hard. In my army, kindness was weakness. We were told to hate, to never question. Reed spoke softly. And do you still believe that? Kurt looked at the bandage on his leg, at the red mark drawn by Reed. His eyes shimmered in the lantern light. No. Not anymore. Silence filled the room. Outside, a shell exploded somewhere miles away, lighting up the horizon. Daniel shifted in his chair. You think he'll make it? Reed nodded. If infection doesn't set in. Miller said, then we make sure it doesn't. Later, when the night had quieted again, Miller passed around a tin of cold beans. They ate in silence, too tired for conversation. But eventually Daniel spoke up. You know, my brother's B-17 got shot down over Hamburg. He never came back. So yeah, I got reasons to hate him. He looked toward Kurt. The German pilot didn't move, but he was listening. Reed said quietly, your brother was a soldier. So's he. Hate the men who started this, not the ones who got dragged into it. Daniels took a long breath, eyes wet but angry. Feels easier to hate a face you can see. Miller said, that's how wars last forever, Private. For a moment no one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the lantern. Kurt whispered, maybe. I chose the wrong side. The words fell like stones in the still air. Reed looked up. Daniels turned away. Miller just watched him, expression unreadable. Kurt went on. They told us we were the chosen ones. The superior race. But in the end all I see is fire. We burn cities, people, even ourselves. Miller said softly, war makes liars out of every flag. Reed checked Kurt's pulse again. Rest, friend. We'll move you when it's safe. Kurt gave a faint smile. Friend. Strange word for enemies. Miller replied, not tonight. The farmhouse creaked under the wind. Miller looked at his men, Reed steady and calm, Daniels restless and conflicted. He thought of his own father, a World War I veteran who once said, America fights hardest when she's defending something bigger than herself. He remembered the first time he enlisted. He believed in victory, in banners, in songs of glory. But after 3 years in Europe he had come to believe in something else, decency. Quiet, uncelebrated, stubborn decency. He rose, pulled his jacket tighter and said, get some rest. We march at dawn. Reed nodded. I'll keep first watch. Daniels muttered, I'll take second. Maybe I'll figure out what decency looks like by then. Miller gave him a tired smile. You just did, son. Hours later, Reed sat alone by the lantern, writing in his small notebook, a letter home to his wife. Dear Anna, he wrote, tonight we saved a German pilot. He was young, scared, and broken. I don't know his story, but I know this. The moment we helped him, the war felt smaller. Maybe that's what victory really is, not killing faster but forgetting slower. He closed the notebook and looked at Kurt sleeping soundly, bandaged and breathing steady. Miller stirred nearby, half asleep but alert as ever. You think anyone will believe this story? He asked quietly. Reed smirked. Probably not. Doesn't sound like war. Sounds like something better. Miller leaned back. Let's hope someday that's the only kind of story people tell. When dawn finally came, the light spread across the fields like a promise. The soldiers packed their gear, checked their weapons, and prepared to move toward the Allied lines. Before they left, Reed tore a strip from his Red Cross armband and tied it to Kurt's wrist. If they find you, they'll know someone cared enough to follow the rules. Kurt's eyes filled with tears. I don't know how to thank you. Miller replied, don't thank us. Just remember. Kurt nodded slowly. I will. And if I live, I will tell them, not all Americans hate. Miller extended his hand. For a second, Kurt hesitated, then took it. The handshake was firm, human, and silent. Reed and Daniels watched as they let go. The German remained behind in the farmhouse, alive because 3 Americans had chosen principle over orders. As they walked away, Daniels said, guess this'll never make it into the reports. Miller answered, doesn't have to. Some things are better left in the heart. They moved down the dirt road, silhouettes fading into the mist. Behind them, the Red Cross flag they tied to the barn fluttered faintly in the morning breeze, a small symbol of something unbreakable. Decency in the middle of destruction. The night exploded without warning. The first shell landed 100 yards from the farmhouse, shaking the earth and blowing out the lantern light. Dust rained from the rafters as Miller shouted, incoming! Grab your gear. Reed was already moving, throwing his medic bag over his shoulder. Daniel snatched his rifle. Outside, orange fire flared across the horizon. A German counterattack, artillery lighting up the French countryside like a hellish sunrise. Kurt tried to sit up on the cot, grimacing from the pain in his leg. They're close, he said through clenched teeth. That's German artillery. Miller barked, no kidding. Reed, can he move? With help, Reed said. He's weak, but he'll make it. Daniels muttered, we can't take him with us, Sarge. We'll be slowed down. Miller's reply was immediate. We don't leave men to die. Not him, not anyone. He looked Kurt straight in the eye. You walk, you live. Let's go. Reed and Daniels hoisted Kurt between them as they rushed into the open night. The farmhouse was already catching fire from a nearby blast. Flames spread through the dry timber, painting the field in red light. The Jeep was parked 50 yards away, half hidden behind a hay cart. Miller jumped into the driver's seat and shouted, "Move it!" Reed and Daniels helped Kurt into the back as another shell burst behind them, throwing dirt into the air. Miller floored the gas pedal. The Jeep tore through the field, bumping over uneven ground, headlights off to avoid detection. The sound of artillery thundered behind them, closer now. Kurt held his wounded leg, breathing hard. Reed glanced back at him. You holding up? Kurt nodded faintly. You should have left me. Miller shouted over the engine, that's not how we do things. For a moment Kurt didn't answer. He just stared at Miller, the man who, hours ago, had been his enemy, now risking everything to save him. They drove for miles through dark country roads, dodging debris and burning fields. The night smelled of smoke and oil. The Jeep rattled over a small bridge when the engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Damn it, Miller growled, hitting the dashboard. We're stuck. Reed jumped out. Axles jammed. Mud. Daniels kicked at the tire. We're sitting ducks out here. Miller grabbed the rifle. Then move. Push it out. The three Americans leaned into the Jeep, boots sinking into the wet earth. The engine refused to budge. Then, unexpectedly, Kurt climbed out too. Reed turned in shock. Kurt, stay down. But Kurt ignored him. He limped around to the front, set his shoulder against the fender, and pushed with all he had. Mud splattered across his face, his wounded leg trembling. I can help, he grunted. Daniels stared, speechless. Miller shouted, keep pushing. The Jeep lurched forward, wheels finally catching traction. With one last shove, it broke free from the rut. Everyone stumbled back, covered in dirt and sweat. Miller looked at Kurt, breathing hard. Didn't expect that from a Nazi pilot. Kurt gave a faint, tired smile. Neither did I. They piled back in, speeding away as tracer rounds streaked through the sky behind them. The distant fire lit up the hills, a German armored column advancing through the valley. Reed tore a strip of cloth from his sleeve and tied it around Kurt's leg again, reinforcing the bandage. You shouldn't be moving on that wound. Kurt looked at him and said quietly, it hurts less than staying behind. For a while no one spoke. The Jeep bumped along the dirt road. The sound of gunfire faded into the distance. Then Miller winced, clutching his arm. Blood seeped through his sleeve. Reed saw it immediately. You're hit. Just a graze, Miller said, brushing it off. Kurt reached over, steadying him as the Jeep hit another bump. You saved me, he said. Now let me return it. Reed watched as Kurt tied Miller's arm with precision. Tight, clean, like a trained medic. Miller said quietly, didn't think you'd know first aid. Kurt answered, my mother was a nurse. Before the war. There was a pause. Then Miller said, she raised a good man. Kurt looked away. She raised a son who forgot what that meant. By dawn they reached the edge of the forest. Smoke drifted from the valley below, where the counterattack had burned through villages. Miller parked the Jeep under the trees. Daniels climbed out and scanned the horizon with binoculars. We're about 5 miles from the Allied line. We can make it by noon. Reed nodded. We'll rest here, patch up, then move. Kurt sat on the ground, exhausted but alive. He listened to the Americans joke quietly, sharing what was left of their rations. A single chocolate bar, split 4 ways. He watched as they laughed, cursed the mud, argued about baseball. And for the first time in years he saw humanity, not propaganda, not enemies, just men doing their best to stay human in a world gone insane. He spoke softly, almost to himself. In my country they said you Americans were savages. But now I see, you're the only ones who still remember mercy. Miller looked at him and said simply, mercy's not weakness, Kurt. It's what keeps us different. Kurt nodded, staring at the rising sun through the smoke. Then maybe, that's what winning really means. The light broke over the trees and for a brief moment, it felt like peace. The Jeep sat under the branches, battered but intact, carrying 4 men who had stopped being enemies somewhere between the fire and the dawn. The sun rose pale and cold over the French fields. Smoke from the night's bombardment still lingered, hanging low like ghosts of the dead. The jeep rolled down a dirt road toward the Allied command post, battered, muddy but still running. Inside sat 4 men who had crossed a line few ever dared to. At the checkpoint, a U.S. military policeman raised his hand. Halt. Identification. Miller handed over his papers. Sergeant John Miller, 3rd Infantry. We've got a German pilot. Injured. Treated. The MP leaned in, eyes narrowing at Kurt in the back seat. He's a Luftwaffe? Reed nodded. Shot down 2 days ago. He's ours now. The MP waved toward a medical tent across the field. Take him to triage. Prisoners go through medical before processing. Miller drove forward slowly. No one spoke. When they reached the tent, medics came running, white armbands flashing red crosses. Kurt was lifted onto a stretcher, grimacing as they carried him away. Reed followed briefly to give a report. Compound fracture left leg. Infection risk. Morphine administered. He's stable. The attending nurse looked up. You boys did good work. He'll live. Reed turned to see Kurt looking back at him. Their eyes met, enemy and savior, bound by something deeper than flags or uniforms. Outside, Miller leaned against the jeep, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. Daniels watched the medics carry Kurt inside. Hard to believe we went through all that for him, he muttered. Miller exhaled smoke slowly. You still think it was a mistake? Daniels paused. No. Just hard to explain to anyone who wasn't there. Miller gave a short nod. Then don't explain. Just remember. Reed rejoined them, wiping his hands on a rag. He's in good care. They'll ship him to the POW camp near Le Havre once he's strong enough. Miller said, then that's where his war ends. Reed glanced toward the horizon. And maybe ours too. Hours later they were ordered to rejoin their unit. Before leaving, Reed walked back into the tent. Kurt lay in a clean cot now, his face pale but peaceful. Reed said softly, we're heading out. Kurt looked at him, voice faint but steady. You saved my life. All of you. Reed smiled. You'd have done the same. Kurt shook his head. I don't know. But I'll try to be the kind of man who would. Miller stepped forward. You'll make it home someday. When you do, remember this wasn't about sides. It was about men. Kurt nodded slowly. I will. You've given me back something the war took, my faith in men. Miller extended his hand. Kurt took it. Their grips were firm, final. Good luck, Sergeant, Kurt said. You too, Lieutenant, Miller replied. Then he turned and walked out into the light. Weeks passed. The war moved on, new battles replaced old ones. But in a quiet POW camp in northern France, Kurt Meissner kept a small notebook, the only thing the Americans hadn't confiscated. He wrote each night in uneven English. August 1944. They found me in a barn. I expected death. Instead they gave me water. They treated my wound. They called me by my name, not my uniform. I saw compassion in men I was taught to hate. They gave me back something the war took, my faith in men. He paused, then added one last line. If I ever fly again, I will remember, humanity has no borders. Far away, in a muddy tent outside Paris, Reed cleaned his medical instruments while Miller read a new dispatch about advancing toward Germany. Daniels was humming a tune from home, his rifle leaning by the door. Miller folded the paper and said quietly, You ever think about that pilot? Reed nodded. Every day. Miller smiled faintly. Good. Means the war hasn't changed us completely. They said nothing more. Outside, the wind carried the smell of autumn and the distant echo of artillery. The world was still burning, but for a few men, something pure had survived the fire. When the war finally ended, Europe was quiet for the first time in years. Towns that had been reduced to rubble began to hum again with the sound of rebuilding. For Kurt Meissner, the silence was louder than any explosion. In 1946, he was released from a prisoner of war camp near Cherbourg. The war had taken his comrades, his homeland, and much of what he believed in. But it had also given him something unexpected. A glimpse of humanity from the very men he was trained to destroy. He returned to Munich, but Germany no longer felt like home. The city was scarred, the sky empty, the faces hollow. For 6 years he rebuilt engines in a small repair shop, saving every mark he could. In 1952, with a sponsorship program for skilled immigrants, Kurt boarded a ship bound for New York. In his coat pocket was a single photograph, 3 American soldiers standing beside a muddy jeep, one of them smiling with a cigarette in his mouth. He settled in Ohio, drawn by the promise of quiet skies and honest work. One summer afternoon he attended a veterans gathering out of curiosity. Rows of folding chairs, flags fluttering, old men wearing caps marked World War II veteran. He stood at the edge of the crowd until someone tapped his shoulder. "Didn't expect to see you again," a voice said. Kurt turned. It was Private Daniels, older now, his face lined but his grin unchanged. For a long moment neither spoke. Then they laughed the way only men who have seen too much can. They shook hands then hugged like brothers. Daniels said, "You ever fix planes anymore?" Kurt smiled. "Only the ones that stay on the ground." Together they opened a small aircraft maintenance shop outside Columbus, Meissner and Daniels Aviation. Their business card read, "Keeping the sky safe, one plane at a time." In the decades that followed, the war faded into stories, then into memories. But every year on Veterans Day, Kurt would stand beside the flag and tell his grandchildren the same thing. The strongest army isn't the one that wins the most battles. It's the one that remembers compassion. He never forgot Sergeant Miller or Corporal Reed. He said their kindness saved his life, and maybe in some way saved his soul too. Wars end, but what we do inside them never fades. The story of Sergeant John Miller and Kurt Meissner isn't about victory or defeat. It's about mercy, the kind that survives bullets, borders, and orders. When the guns fell silent, what remained wasn't the roar of tanks or the glory of medals. It was the quiet moment in a French barn, where one man chose to see an enemy as a human being. That choice, small, almost invisible, echoed across a lifetime. It built a friendship, a business, and a legacy that outlived every headline of the war. Because in the end, what defines America isn't how hard we fight, but how deeply we care. If stories like this remind you of what America stands for, honor, decency, and the courage to show mercy, then join us. Subscribe to channel and help us keep history human. Some say the German pilot never existed. That it was just a story passed around between soldiers, told in smoky bars and long after curfews. Some say it happened near St. Lo, others swear it was near Cannes. Maybe it's a myth, a tale polished smooth by memory and time. But behind every myth, there's a truth worth remembering. Because even if the names have faded, the message endures. That compassion can bloom in the middle of war, that enemies can share a moment of grace, that mercy is stronger than fear. Somewhere in the archives there's a photo, an American soldier and a German pilot sitting side by side on a fence, sharing a cigarette, looking out over an empty field. The smoke curls upward, thin and fragile against the calm sky. Maybe that's how it ended. Maybe it's just a story. But if it is, it's the kind of story America should never forget.